And so we're in chapter 2 from verse 18. We're going to go all the way through to chapter 3, verse 6. So they're three little sections. Okay, so Mark chapter 2, reading from verse 18. Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, "How is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not?" Jesus answered, "How can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, otherwise the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the wine will burst, and the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins, will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins." One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the cornfields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some ears of corn. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate sacred bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he gave some to his companions. He also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.' Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with a shriveled hand, 'Stand up in front of everyone.' Then Jesus asked them, 'Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?' But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. Said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus." We just pray for Chris. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for Chris. Pray that he'd be able to speak clearly this morning, that you would give him a message for us. And pray now that we'd open our hearts and our minds to hear that word from you by your Spirit. Amen.
Fab. I had my welcome to Sharks. Lovely to see everybody this morning. I've got a slide for us to kick off with. Dave, if you could pop that up. Thank you. We're working our way through Mark's Gospel at the moment this term, sort of bit by bit. Started fairly slowly, but the accelerator's going down a little bit more in terms of trying to move things along. And we've said along the way that Mark sort of groups his material quite carefully and quite cleverly. So we've seen lots about Jesus' identity so far. And what we've got in chapter 2, as you can see there, is basically Mark has put 5 conflict stories together. And we begin to see this coming together, this clashing between Jesus and the religious leaders. Now, as we sort of start, and we've looked at the first 2, so we're just going to look at those last 3 that Jacques just read to us this morning. A couple of things just to do. I think it'd be useful just for a second, just to think in your mind, if you were to imagine the most religious or devout or committed person, Christian, to think about what would come to mind. How would you make that sort of assessment of a person, sort of level of devotion or godliness or something? What would be your criteria? What comes to mind? And the other thing, for those of us here this morning that like to multitask, I'm going to give you something to do at the same time as listening. So if you're like me and you can only do one thing at a time, just listen. But if you like to do something else, I've set you a little challenge. You might want to just glance at Genesis chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2. And the question is, what's the difference between the 7th day in creation and the other 6? So there's something you can do while showing off your amazing ability to multitask. We'll get to that in a second. So we're going to look at this conflict, this battle. It's been announced, hasn't it? 4th of July. We thought the 4th of July was simply American Day of Independence or the Swales wedding anniversary, but they're going to share that this year with a general election. So I want you to picture, I don't know where to put people, let's put Marilyn in the red corner, or not Marilyn, but this area over here is the red corner. We'll put Keir Starmer, of course, over there, and the blue corner here. Rishi Sunak. Of course, there are many other corners and candidates, but we kind of know the way things happen. So it's a battle between red and blue, these different corners. Now, we're going to put the Pharisees across there, teachers of the law. They're the one sort of candidate or fighter in this encounter in Mark 2. And we notice from what Jacques read to us, you might want to just keep chapter 2 open and glance down. We know from these people over here that that fasting was a big thing for them. So that's the first incidence around fasting. Interestingly, the Old Testament God only requires fasting from his people once a year in the Old Testament on the Day of Atonement, which was a day of sort of repentance and sort of preparation for having their sins dealt with. That was the time they were commanded to fast. And yet in the Old Testament, there are many examples of people fasting, often in times of distress or sort of deep grief. Sometimes as an expression of people's repentance and awareness of their sin and coming to God. Sometimes they would fast when looking for God's provision or protection in a future event. So it could be a national kind of fasting that happened, a corporate fasting. Sometimes it was individual fasting. Now, if you wind the clock forward to the 1st century and Jesus now being on the ground in Mark 2, fasting had become really an expected expression of someone being a pious person or a committed person or a person who was devoted to God. The Pharisees fasted twice a week. That was well established by this stage. Jesus even refers to them in a parable later on, talking to God about how they fast twice a week. So that had become the kind of embedded norm in terms of godliness, spirituality, devotion. And we know from verse 18 that not only were the Pharisees fasting, but John the Baptist's disciples were fasting as well. Have a look down at verse 18. Now, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, how is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not? The clear expectation, it's really important that we grab this, the clear expectation is that if Jesus were a truly religious man, truly from God, and that his disciples sort of with him, which actually is highly doubtful following the incident with Levi, to eat with sinners and tax collectors, to share a meal with people like that, caused huge doubt about in their minds about Jesus's sort of godliness or sort of devotion. So they were doubting it already. But if Jesus were a religious man, a man of God like them, then he would surely be following the standard religious practice of fasting twice a week, as would his disciples. Another passion, which the 4th and 5th conflicts up there are about, was for the Sabbath. So those in the red corner were big on the Sabbath day. So in verses 23 and 24, if you just glance down to that second incident, they observed Jesus' disciples walking through the fields, picking and eating some grain as they walked along. And we find them in chapter 3, verse 2, in the final conflict incident up there, watching very, very closely as to what Jesus was going to do. Was Jesus going to heal this man on the Sabbath day? So they're sort of, I don't know, sort of meerkat-like, or, sort of a bird in the garden who suddenly hears a rustle. They're on edge, they're looking. What is he going to do? Why are they eating the grain as they walk? And is he going to heal on the Sabbath day? And just as fasting had been elevated to that sort of big status, the Pharisees would add layers upon layers of additional rules and regulations stipulating what couldn't be done on a Sabbath day. In order to keep the commandment holy, to keep it, they would lay on their 10, 20, 30, 39 extra rules and regulations. And again, the clear expectation on the ground here in Mark 2 is that if Jesus really is of God, bearing in mind the stir he's causing, the people that are flocking to hear him, they would expect him not to be doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. So that's sort of where the conflict is. And that's where they are, watching, looking to catch him out, examining everything he does, and coming to conclusions about him. Now, in the blue corner over here, the one who's now going to come into this conflict with them is someone who Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, the doctor for the sick, the bridegroom, a name used of God himself in the Old Testament, and the Lord. So this is where the conflict is between these two. And Jesus makes it clear in the third conflict up there that his disciples don't fast because now is not the time for fasting. That's essentially the message. Now, says Jesus, is not the time for grieving and mourning over sin. And look at the example he gives, verse 19. Think of an upcoming marriage. Jesus answered, how can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot. So long as they have him with them, they cannot fast. I know some of the things Susan got up to yesterday. How was the golf, Susan, by the way? Brilliant. Indoor crazy golf with friends and so on. Earlier in the day, birthday cake and students and family and friends gathering. Can you imagine if somebody let's imagine somebody else organised that event for Susan. Can you imagine if they declared a day of fasting on Susan's 40th birthday? I don't know about that. That wouldn't have gone down well with Susan, but it's sort of ridiculous. The whole thing is that you meet, you celebrate, you eat, you drink, you rejoice together. That's the sense of what Jesus is saying here. It's like the owners of Manchester United, organising a day of fast or an evening of fast last night, having won, unexpectedly the FA Cup final. It just doesn't fit. Jesus is saying that it's not the time for his disciples to be fasting. And the point that he then goes on to make, which looks a little bit cryptic, I don't know what you made of it as Jacques read, is essentially Jesus is saying here that this is not the time to fast, not only because the bridegroom is here, again, using the name of God, the bridegroom is here among you, but actually there is something brand new happening now. The new is replacing the old. Jesus talks about, and I'm out of my knowledge zone here, about sort of making clothes and sewing, patches onto clothing. And he talks about wine and wineskins. Again, I have no idea of any of this. But let's read what Jesus says, verse 21. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth onto an old garment, otherwise the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins. Jesus is saying here that with the bridegroom among them, something, in a sense, brand new is about to happen. Fasting was an expression of sorrow over sin, grieving over sin and preparing for future salvation. But Jesus is saying, essentially, that salvation is now here. The King is among you. The bridegroom is here. This is a massive moment. The age of salvation is about to dawn. The kingdom is here. And again, the examples I can give are so small in comparison, but you think of a new baby. I think this is quite common with new parents, that moment that the baby has arrived and it's dawned on you that a baby has arrived, there's that sense in which life is now, it's changed. It's never going to be the same. For some of those MPs planning their goodbyes in the autumn, in an instant, their life has changed. That announcement, something is going to change. The declaration of war, life is changing. The declaration of an end of war, life is changing. That's the sense of Jesus as they nitpick about whether his disciples are fasting or not. Jesus is saying, you're stood on the moment where history is about to change forever. The age of salvation is here. The bridegroom is here. This is not the time to fast. And don't miss verse 20 before we move on. Jesus says the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. And on that day they will fast. So as they see him walking through the streets of Jerusalem, as they see him with the crossbeam, as they see him lifted up, as they see the one that they trusted in as God's king, and for a moment are confused and their hopes are dashed, then they will fast, says Jesus, but not now. In the fourth conflict, the second from last up in the table behind us, the attention moves to the Sabbath, and Jesus now, in a sense, goes a little bit more on he advances towards them a bit more. He essentially says, do you know your Bibles? As he stares down those in the blue corner. Have you read about David? And then he essentially says, you've completely misunderstood the purpose of the Sabbath day. Verses 25 and 26, Jesus reminds them that David, as God's king in waiting, came with his companions. They were running from King Saul. They were desperate for their lives. They were hungry. They approached for some bread. There wasn't bread. The only bread available was the consecrated bread. And the priest there gives the bread to David to eat. And these Pharisees no doubt held David as possibly the greatest king Israel have ever had. They hold him in high regard. And yet he did what was unlawful out of desperation. And Jesus here then points them effectively to Deuteronomy 25 and says that picking grain as you go through a field is lawful. There's actually a verse in Deuteronomy 23 that describes this very situation, declaring it to be lawful. Yes, that you can't take out your shears and you can't bring in your combine harvester in somebody's field that you're going through. That wasn't allowed, but you can pick bits of grain as you're going through a field. That's okay. Now, the comeback from the Pharisees here is perhaps, okay, you've got us, Deuteronomy, it's okay. 6 days a week, it's okay. But not on the Sabbath. Not on God's holy day of rest. In their great passion over there in the red corner to keep the Sabbath holy and refrain from work, they had so many extra rules and regulations that were on top of what God's law said. So there were even laws about how far you could walk on the Sabbath. So you literally walk up to a certain point and not go in. If you went to there, you're okay, but one more step and you're breaking the Sabbath, was what the Pharisees had to say. You could carry a loaf of bread a certain distance on the Sabbath, and you could carry it more than that if 2 of you carried the loaf, because you're reducing the workload. That's the level at which the Pharisees were sort of working at. Jesus' response really is simple in verse 27. He says, you've missed the whole point of the Sabbath day. Verse 27, he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. It's not as if we've sort of been made in order to keep your hundreds of rules and regulations on this day. You've lost the whole point of what the Sabbath is about. The Sabbath was a gracious provision from God for people. It's a blessing to people. The Sabbath was made for man. A day to rest from your labours, a complete break from your work. A day to break from your studies, to break from your schoolwork, to put down tools. A gift to you, a day to rest, recuperate, replenish, a good provision for us. 6 days you shall labour and do all of your work, but the Sabbath is a rest day to the Lord. And you notice as you go through the Bible how this is fleshed out. So in Exodus 20, when the commandments are given, they're to remember their Creator on the Sabbath, especially remember the one who worked for 6 days and then rested. Remember your Creator. In Deuteronomy 5, as they're planning to enter the promised land, remember your redemption on the Sabbath day. Remember your Redeemer. Remember your rescue. Spend time thinking about the rescue from Egypt and bringing you out to head towards the promised land. And of course, for us, our redemption from evil and sin and death in the cross. The Sabbath is a good gift. And yet the Pharisees had turned it really into a day, I think, of work. So many rules and regulations, trying not to trip over, trying not to do this, being so aware. I just feel very uptight thinking about the whole thing. The day had been robbed of its purpose. The Sabbath was made for man. Jesus also makes that amazing declaration then that must have got really under their skin in verse 28. The Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath. This is a title Jesus uses of himself, taken from the book of Daniel, a powerful figure who comes into the presence of God the Father, the Ancient of Days, and is given all authority from him. And Jesus has used that in chapter 2 earlier, verse 10. He has the authority to forgive sins. And here he is the Lord of the Sabbath. And it means far more, and this is where if you've been multitasking, I'm going to need your help. This is more than the fact that Jesus has the power to declare that it's okay to pick grain or blackberries on the Sabbath. He is Lord of the Sabbath in a much bigger way. So the Sabbath in the Bible is not simply one day among 7. It is much more than that. So has anybody actually had a little look? It'd be a pain if nobody has. Anybody look back at Genesis to notice the difference between the 7th day and the other 6?
There's no evening and morning.
Wisdom, 40th year. Brilliant. Yeah, there's a few differences in that there aren't things sort of created and that sort of thing. But yeah, every day ends with evening and morning. But the 7th day, there is no evening and morning. The 7th day, the Sabbath, just goes on. There is no end. And the Bible develops that picture of people being created in the image and likeness of God to know him in a perfect world into a future that has no end, this perfect paradise-like existence. It doesn't end. And that theme then of the 7th day and linking it to God's rest continues through the Bible. It becomes a picture of the promised land. God is going to take them to a land of their own, a land of rest, a land of plenty, an Eden-like land. It then becomes a picture of heaven itself, the paradise of God, the eternal kingdom, the inheritance for those who are in Christ, the rest that is ahead. When we rest from our labours and remember our Creator and remember our redemption, we're also, on that day of rest, foretasting the rest, the Sabbath that God is taking us to. I don't know, sorry, so I'll put Susan on the spot too much here, but I don't know if you noticed the balloon when you came in. Oh, Susan, she's not so wise. Let's imagine she did. It's a birthday balloon. Susan loves dinosaurs. And I was hoping that she would sit there and notice it and sort of think, oh, I wonder if that could be for me. I wonder if that could be part of my future to receive, the dinosaur balloon. She's too humble to think like that. But it's there, something you can see that is pointing to something that's coming. And that's sort of how the Sabbath functions in the Bible, the day of rest. It forces you to look back to the Creator who rested. It forces you on a day of rest to look back to the redemption and rescue that God has brought. But it forces you to look forward, and that it's a foretaste of the fact that God is going to take his people back into that rest, back into the paradise of God, into his kingdom forever. So here in verse 28, Jesus confirms he is the Son of Man, and he, the Son of Man, is Lord of the Sabbath rest. He's the Lord of God's eternal kingdom. So when Jesus says in Matthew 11 to those around him, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." He's not saying, is he, to hardworking people who are worn out, "Come to me, follow me, and you'll have a much more relaxed, chillful life." He's saying, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will take you into that eternal rest, into that paradise of God, into my kingdom forever." He is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, things hot up, and we've 2 minutes just to finish this now this morning. Things hot up. I wanted to announce this morning, but he's not here, I don't think, which is a real shame. But throughout this year, we've had a fantasy football league running in the church. About a dozen people have been picking their football team, taking players from all the Premier League teams, putting them together, putting them into the formation, deciding who's going to sit on the subs bench, who are they going to transfer and get rid of, and who are they going to bring in. And so a dozen people or so, and last weekend or so, the Premier League came to an end, and so did the Church Fantasy Football League. And we have a winner. His name is Pete Turner, and you can pass this on, Paul, because we don't see Pete, goes to a different church, so we've disqualified him. So promoted into third place, I believe, is Isaac. Very good. And the first and second place was a real tussle. I don't think either of them were in the room. It was a real tussle. There was only 2 points separated them at the end. I think Mike ended up coming in second, and then our winner, but behind Pete, some considerable distance behind Pete, was Andy Bruce. So yeah, I was hoping to give Andy a round of applause, but again, he'll maybe another time. And I saw Andy, I think in the week leading up to the final set of matches, and he was on it. He was on it. He was studying his team. He was wrestling about who should he transfer, who should he bring in for the final game on the last weekend. He'd even looked at Mike's team to see what Mike was going to do. So it was sort of fever pitch, for Andy it was the pressure. So I'm really sorry he's missed out on the round of applause he would have had. But there's that sense of tension and building as you come towards the end. And I think in terms of these 5 conflict stories, Mark, we are pretty sure this is not chronological. If you look at Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, you can build a slightly different chronology, but Mark is the author of his gospel, and he's arranging his material, as we said at the beginning, to make a point. And so he's bringing these 5 conflict stories together, and it builds to a head with this last one. Chapter 3, verse 1. Another time later, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, so not shrinking back, is he? Stand up in front of everyone. Then Jesus asked them, which is lawful to do on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill? And notice that those in verse 2 in the red corner that are on the edge of their seat to see, is Jesus going to break their Sabbath rules? When Jesus questions them about the use of the Sabbath in verse 4, they remain silent. What's the Sabbath for? Says Jesus. And hear the hearts of these Pharisees, these teachers of the law, people revered by the community. Their hearts are exposed. They would rather this man remain unhealed and keep his withered hand and all that meant for his life. Yes, Jesus could heal him on another day, but not today. For that would be to break their Sabbath rules. And yet at the same time, in the same hearts, they want Jesus to heal the man, because it will perversely strengthen their case against him. Which is lawful to do on the Sabbath, asked Jesus, to do good or to do evil, to give life or to kill? And he looked around at them, verse 5, in his anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Jesus is so angry at what he sees in the hearts of the spiritual leaders of his people. He's deeply distressed. For Jesus, the Sabbath was an opportunity to do good and to save life, which again mirrors the future rest. That's what he's come to do, to save and give life. The Pharisees, however, verse 6, went out and began to plot with their enemies, the Herodians, how they might kill Jesus. They fasted twice a week. They had 39 extra rules and regulations. Such was their passion to keep the fourth commandment, to keep the Sabbath day holy. They gave a tenth of everything they had. They gave it away. And they plot to kill an innocent man for doing good on the Sabbath day. There's a warning embedded in these sort of incidents, isn't there, that says that external, observable spirituality, whatever that might be for you or me, can be so misleading. What does a person think about Jesus? How do they view him? How do they love him? How do they follow him? That's a different thing. Just pop the last slide up. I'll let you glance through this. I won't read it to you. I think what Mark wants to see amidst all of the other things, and there may be questions actually over coffee to chat a bit about Well, what does fasting mean for us? What does having a day of rest mean for us? They're good conversations for coffee. But I think most of all, Mark wants us to see in these 5 stories, see the Son of Man, see the doctor who's come for the spiritually sick, see the bridegroom and the new age of salvation that's dawning, see the Lord of the Sabbath, see the one who heals and restores and cleanses and forgives, see the one who calls sinners and eats with them as the opposition grows. We said a couple of weeks ago, Genesis 3:15, after the fall into sin, God said, didn't he, that he would put enmity between the Satan and the woman, between Satan's offspring and the woman's offspring, and there would be this almighty clash in the future where one would strike the heel of one and the other would crush the head and bring victory. And we've seen in Mark, we've seen the gathering of evil spirits and the confrontation with Jesus. But in Mark 2 here, we see exactly the same thing, this battle, this conflict between good and evil, Jesus and the powers of darkness. But hear his call as we finish. I'll hand back to Jacques. Hear his call. He's dealing with all these sinful leaders and people, but ultimately he's come for the lost. He's come for you. He's come for me. He calls us to follow him. Jacques.